Hello, I'm here today to talk about the Greek historian Herodotus, the so-called father of history. Uh, I'm going to talk about the man himself. I'm going to go into biographical details. I'm going to go into the context of his world, his literary inheritance, uh, the history of Greece at the time, and then I'm going to give like a sort of 10,000 foot view of his book, his book called the Histories, also known as the Inquiries of Herodotus, which is about the Greco-Persian Wars. I'm going to do a sort of 10,000 foot view look at it, and then I'm going to go into details about why Herodotus is so great, why he's such a great writer, what's so unique to him, and what's so interesting about him. And then I'm going to get into the details of the narrative, the war between Greece and Persia. That's his subject. And then after that, I want to talk about criticism that Herodotus faced, his work has faced since he finished it. What other writers in antiquity were criticizing him. And then I'm going to get into some more modern books about Herodotus and his subject matter, and also talk about one of Herodotus's near contemporaries, and then I think that'll wrap it up. I think that's the overall structure of the video. So I think it's going to be long, and I just wanted to tell you beforehand what the plan is. So Herodotus, the father of history. I want to first talk about what that title means. Now, it's important to note that that title, the father of history, was given to him 2,000 years ago. So Herodotus was born in 484 BC, but it was Cicero, who lived 400 years after Herodotus, who called Herodotus the father of history. So that name comes from Cicero, the famous orator, Roman statesman, consul, among other things. And so what that title basically means, and he's still called that today, we basically, if you're to accept that, it's just he was the first person to write a history book in the way that we view history in the modern sense. He was the first person to be considered a historian. But I don't want to just leave it at that. I want to talk about what that actually meant at the time. What was so the magnitude of his achievement that this book is. So I think the important thing to talk about first is the context of Herodotus. So again, this is 5th century Greece. This is 484 BC when Herodotus is born. He writes his book between around 440 BC and 430 BC. And it's important to note that when he was 5 years old, in 479 BC, the Greeks essentially had decisive victory against the Persians, the Persian Empire, at the Battle of Plataea. And so, again, to go back real quick, let's look at what did it, if you were Herodotus, what was your education? What was your idea of the world? And how did you come to the conclusion that you needed to write a book about recent events? So I think in order to understand that achievement, I have to talk about briefly like education in antiquity. If you're someone who lived in Greece at this time, your education was the poems of Homer. This is your education. So all you needed to know about life and history is the poems of Homer, mainly the Iliad. This is the founding text of education. This is your idea of literature and your idea of history. Because if you're someone who living at the Greece at the time, the only history worth recounting and learning about is the mythological history of your city-state, your country. You were only concerned with a past golden age when heroes and gods walked among men on the earth. You know, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Achilles, Odysseus. Those were the stories from their history that they deemed worth learning about. And it was real to them. It was real history to them. For us, it's like, it's mythology, but to them it was real. It was history. And as far as that goes, the only other history that you'd be concerned with is your own lineage of your family. In antiquity, it was a habit of the aristocratic families in Greece and Rome in order to justify your high position in society, you had to trace back your lineage to a god or a hero, to Theseus or Romulus or Venus, or, name any mythological character. So the only history you're concerned with is the history of Homer and the history of your own family. Outside of that, not really anything else. And then let's look at the literature leading up to the 5th century. In Greece, in the 6th and 5th centuries, or the 7th, 6th, and 5th centuries, the main literary form was the lyric. There was lyric poetry. There was this explosion of poetry all over Greece. You got poets like Theognis. I think it's pronounced right. Theognis. Theognis or Theognis? I don't know the exact pronunciation. And then there's poets like Sappho and Alcaeus and even Solon, the famous Athenian lawmaker and statesman from the 6th century BC. All these poets, and they wrote in the lyric. That was their literary format, the lyric. And then you got, of course, Hesiod for your mythology. And then when it came to Greek prose, there was Greek prose at the time, and it was mainly the domain of chroniclers. There were these people called chroniclers in Greece at the time, chroniclers and geographers. And what they did is they basically went around collecting facts and like organizing facts, chronicling them, basically. But no narrative history. They just collected facts, and that was it. There was nothing really to string them together. So here's where Herodotus comes in, right? His education is, okay, the only important history you have is the stuff a long time ago with the Trojan War, when there was heroes and gods. And also, poetry, verse, is the main form of literary expression, with the exception of these chroniclers with their prose. And so Herodotus, having grown up, being 5 years old when the Battle of Plataea happens, when the Greeks win against the Persian Empire, he's thinking to himself, okay, well, that golden age history is all well and good, but there's some pretty important things that have happened in recent living memory that is worth remembering. It's not just the Trojan War that's worth remembering, but it's also this Greco-Persian War that we need to make sure is not forgotten. So that's the first step he takes. He says, okay, I must tell the story of the Greco-Persian War. And so here's where Herodotus differentiates himself from the chroniclers. A chronicler would go around and just collect facts. Greeks won here. There were these people there. This thing happened there. Herodotus is the one to string events together and make a narrative, to tell a story. That is the first part of his invention. And so for Herodotus to explain, okay, how did a ragtag group of city-states fight off the might of the Persian Empire? How did that happen? How do I explain that? So he looks at the Battle of Plataea, 479 BC. He says, okay, how do I explain Battle of Plataea? I got to go back a year to the Battle of Salamis. In order for me to explain the Battle of Salamis, I got to explain the Battle of Thermopylae. And in order for me to explain the Battle of Thermopylae, I need to go back 10 years to 490 BC and look at the Battle of Marathon. And in order for me to look at the Battle of Marathon and explain that event, I have to look at the reign of King Darius, the Persian king who had launched the Battle of Marathon. I need to look at the reign of that king in order to explain Marathon. But in order for me to explain the reign of that king, I have to explain the reign of the previous king, King Cambyses. And in order for me to explain King Cambyses, I have to explain Cyrus the Great and him founding the Persian Empire. And in order for me to explain that, I need to go back to the childhood of Cyrus. So you see here how he's stringing the events, how he's connecting things. So in order for him to explain the events of 479 BC with the Battle of Plataea, he needs to go back almost over 100 years to Cyrus, the birth of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. So this is the first time someone has decided to create a narrative history out of something that's not necessarily mythology in a golden age long past. in something that happened in living memory. He's connecting these events in order to explain them. So in order for him to explain 479 BC, he has to basically go back to 600 BC with the birth of Cyrus the Great. So that's the first step. The second step, I was talking about Greek prose, right? The chroniclers used Greek prose to tell their facts, their geographical details. But Herodotus, in order for him to tell his story, he's not going to tell it in verse. He's just not going to do that. He's going to tell it in prose, but he has no literary foundation for what a long work of Greek prose looks like. There hasn't been one in Greece at the time. So Herodotus is the first person to make an art form out of Greek prose. He writes the first long extended work of Greek prose. And since when I was talking about education in antiquity, right? Your education was the poems of Homer. You didn't really read Homer. You heard Homer. There were bards who would recite the poems. They would improvise and tell the story of the Trojan War. And so there was an oral history in Greece of telling these stories. Herodotus, he's writing in prose, but he's writing it so that it can be spoken. The histories of Herodotus are written so that they are recited to an audience. So, to recap, Herodotus deserves the father of history because he's the first person to to realize that important things have happened in recent events, and we must explain those events to whatever degree we can in order for them to not be forgotten, these great deeds to be forgotten. Second is he invents the new literary form, the art of Greek prose. So that is why Cicero called him the father of history, and that's why we still call him the father of history. He's the first person to have that modern sense of historical storytelling. So that's why I wanted to explain that. I didn't want to just passively accept that. I think when we look at it that way, we can understand the magnitude of that achievement, right? And so I briefly want to look at some maps just so we can sort of cement in our mind the geographical details of this conflict, the conflict between Greece and Persia, right? So let's look at that. Okay, so I just want to quickly look at some maps here to just explain the geography of Greece and Persia at the time. So going in this book here, The History of the World Map by Map, we can flip to a page here, The Rise of the Persian Empire. Okay, so we can look at the geography here. So all of this here is the Persian Empire, all of this. So we have Egypt here, Persian Empire stretching out into Asia, and here is Greece. Right there. That's Greece. So the reason why Herodotus is drawn to this narrative of telling this war, he's looking at this and saying, okay, how the heck did this fight off the might of all of this? How did that happen? How do I explain how this happened? So now let's look at this area. Let's look at Greece at the time. So flipping to this page here. So you can see the bust of Pericles right there. But so here is Greece. Here is Greece. They're just city-states scattered out throughout the Mediterranean. So let's look at some of the big names here. So right here, right there, is Athens. Down here is Sparta. And then you got other big names like Thebes up here, Corinth, and Olympia. And then Herodotus is born in a part of the world called the Halicarnassus. That is right there. Right there. That little area is the Halicarnassus. And as you can see, Herodotus is born basically, even though he is a Greek, he's born within the Persian Empire, basically. This area is right bordering on the Persian Empire. So that would explain some of the great degree of tolerance that Herodotus shows towards other religions and cultures throughout his narrative, because he was in a part of the world where he was exposed to a lot of different culture. And so you can see where Herodotus was born relative to the bigger names, the bigger players like Athens and Sparta. So I just wanted to show that. And then there's actually a further page here showing the Greco-Persian War. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to see here with the camera, but this just shows all the route that Xerxes' armies take, the route that Darius' landing at Marathon took. So yeah, this is a great book overall, but I wanted to show you sort of the geography and the outlay of what the world looked like in the Mediterranean and the Near East during this time in history, and why Herodotus felt compelled to tell the narrative he did. So just wanted to show you that. And there is also another map I quickly want to look at. So I have this book here, Atlas of Ancient History by Michael Grant. So there's a certain page in here that I want to flip to. Give me 1 second. There it is. Okay. So there's a map in here, an interesting map. This is the world according to Herodotus. This is the world as Herodotus saw it. So you can see here you have all this is Libya. This is actually Africa, and then you got a somewhat good outlay of Greece here, and then you have Europe, Scythia, and then Arabia. But as you can see here, this, if you were Herodotus at the time, this is what your idea of the world looked like, the geographical outlay of it. So I think this is a really cool map to help contextualize what it was like to be Herodotus at this time, what it was like to be a member of the Athenian audience who he was talking to while he was telling his inquiries. So I just wanted to show you that interesting map. Okay, so now that I've mentioned what it means to have the title the Father of History, I wanted to imagine for a second, let's imagine that we are in the audience when Herodotus is going to recite his history for the first time, right? Because I mentioned that the history was written to be spoken. So let's imagine we are living in Athens in the 5th century, let's say around 430 BC, and Herodotus has come to, let's say, the Olympic Games. You know, it's a nice day, people are competing, and Herodotus is there to recite what he has seen and heard and written. So I'm now going to read the first paragraph of Herodotus, the first thing he says in his book. So he says, Herodotus of Halicarnassus here displays his inquiry so that human achievements may not become forgotten in time, and great and marvelous deeds, some displayed by Greeks, some by barbarians, may not be without their glory, and especially to show why the two peoples fought each other. So that's his sort of justification to his audience. Like, this is why I've come here to say these things. This is the cause for my narrative. So yeah, and again, like if you're in the audience, you're thinking to yourself, okay, that's interesting, because again, your education was Homer. That's the only history you're concerned with. So I just wanted to sort of contextualize that first paragraph there. Okay, so the next thing we should think about is, okay, if you're Herodotus and you have decided that things in recent living memory are worth taking down and remembering, how are you going to go about doing that? What methods are you going to use to get all the facts you need to write this history, right? So Herodotus, at several points, kind of insinuates as to what his methods were, how he sort of came to his conclusions or collected information. And I've chosen a few selections from his work, a few statements that I think highlight that part of his narrative. It's showing you how he sort of collected his information. So I'm going to read a few excerpts now and just talk about it, and then we can go forward from there. So in book 2 of the Histories, his book here, it's divided into 9 parts, 9 books, and one for each of the muses in Greek mythology. And so in book 2, Herodotus is in Egypt, and he went there to get as much information as he could from the priests and the travelers, and what he could collect about King Cambyses, who did an expedition to Egypt. And so here's a statement that Herodotus gives that gives you an idea of how he collected his facts. So I put my glasses here. So he says, the opinion I have expressed about the extent of Egypt is supported by an oracle delivered from the shrine of Ammon, which came to my notice after I had formed my own conclusions. So I think that's that's how he sort of explains his opinions, drawing his conclusions, and how he's coming to tell these things to the reader, to the listener. So I think that's one example of it, of what Herodotus is doing, of how he's collecting his facts and telling a story. So the context for this next quotation is Herodotus sort of acting as a journalist. He goes to one place in Egypt and asks questions, and then he goes to a different place and asks the same questions and sort of compares the two answers from two different sources. So he's seeking out sources, collecting information, and presenting them to you such that you can form your own conclusions, or he can tell you what he thinks about it. So I'm going to read you just a small snippet of that. So he says, "There were other things too, which I learnt at Memphis in conversation with the priests of Hephaestus. And I actually went to Thebes and Heliopolis for the express purpose of finding out if the priests in those cities would agree in what they told me with the priests at Memphis." So he tells you right there, he's just comparing sources and seeing what they say. And then I'm pulling from a broader context. There's much more that I could read from here, but just for the sake of brevity, I'm gonna just highlight that one aspect where he's telling you what he's doing, how he came to these conclusions and says what he says. And then here is just another example from later on in book 2 when he's still in Egypt. So he says, "Anyone may believe these Egyptian tales if he is sufficiently credulous. As for myself, I keep to the general plan of this book, which is to record the traditions of the various nations just as I heard them related to me." So that's one of the refreshing things about Herodotus. He does not really discriminate. He writes down what he hears and he puts it in the book based on the fact as to how interesting it is. So Herodotus, really throughout the book, is just exhausting his own interest. And so he'll just drop a subject when he becomes disinterested. And if he finds two things that are ridiculous to be interesting, he'll still tell you and say, come to your own conclusion. This is just what I've heard. I'm just writing down what I've heard. So this next part comes from book 4 of his book, of his narrative. And so he says, "No one has any accurate information about what lies beyond the region I am now discussing, and I have never met anyone who claims to have actually seen it." And then later on in that paragraph, he says, "I will, nevertheless, put down everything which careful inquiry about these remote parts has brought to my notice." So when he's going beyond the realms of his own knowledge and other people's knowledge, he'll tell you. This happens in a few other spots in the book, and that's where you get these really interesting tall tales, which I'll get to soon. That's where the really interesting stuff starts to come out. But again, he's showing you here where he's telling the reader and the listener, I can't really prove this stuff, or I can't really verify these facts, but nonetheless, and he tells you. And that's exhilarating when he does that. And actually, going back to book 2, when he's in Egypt, there's another thing he says that I just love. So he says, "Up to this point, I have confined what I have written to the results of my own direct observation and research, and the views I have formed from them. But from now on, the basis of my story will be the accounts given to me by the Egyptians themselves, though here, too, I shall put in one or two things which I have seen with my own eyes." So again, he just tells you. He says, from here on out, there's not much here that I've seen with my own eyes, but I'll tell you nonetheless, and you come to your own conclusions. And I also want to point out, again, and we'll talk about more of this in a little bit, this is one of the things about Herodotus that is just so great. It's he's famous for this. It's his digressions. Now remember, this is a book about the Greco-Persian Wars, right? But he's talking about Egypt, which has pretty much nothing to do with that conflict. And yet he spends 90 pages in Egypt telling everyone what he saw and what he heard, and it's amazing. So I should point out that the Greco-Persian Wars, the actual meat of the battles, doesn't really happen until the last 35% of the book. You go a great distance throughout the book until you actually get to the battles, like Marathon and Thermopylae, the ones that everyone knows of. And you can't get angry at Herodotus about it, because when he tells you something, it's always interesting. So when you're in Egypt and he's like, "I heard about, this crazy stuff out there," he just says something. I'm not going to give an example. I'll give more examples in a little bit. He'll just tell you something ridiculous and you go, "Yeah, sure. Tell me more. Tell me more about it. What'd you hear, man?" That's sort of how it goes throughout Herodotus. And the point I'm trying to work to here is every single page is interesting. Every single page of this book is just thrilling. You never, ever, ever know what he's going to say next. He just comes out of nowhere with the most random stuff, and he just keeps you on your toes. So, yeah, that's one section I wanted to highlight. Herodotus' methods. How is he collecting information? How is he distinguishing things for the reader, the listener? Stuff of that sort. So the next aspect of Herodotus, and he's famous for this, is the mythological aspects. So in antiquity, there are writers who aren't really writing like a hard science history like Thucydides. They're writing mytho-history. They're talking about mythological characters and mythological beliefs. So Herodotus, parts of his book are mythological history, mytho-history. Another example of this is in the Roman world, Livy, the Roman historian Livy, wrote mytho-history. And just in the same way that Herodotus is only adding stuff that he finds interesting, same with Livy. He's telling the mythology of Rome and Carthage and all these things, and keeping it interesting. And so one of the defining aspects of Herodotus is these mythological parts of his book. So I wanted to read a few excerpts of that just to give you a sense of to what extent mythology plays a role in the narrative. So in book 2, we're still in book 2. Book 2 is the Egypt book. Nothing in here really about the Greco-Persian Wars. It's just what Herodotus saw and heard in Egypt. So in book 2, Herodotus writes, "The Greeks tell many stories with no thought. One of the silliest is the story of how Heracles came to Egypt and was taken away by the Egyptians to be sacrificed to Zeus, with all due pomp and the sacrificial wreath upon his head, and how he quietly submitted until the moment came for the beginning of the actual ceremony at the altar, where he exerted his strength and killed them all. For me, at least, such a tale is proof enough that the Greeks know nothing whatever about Egyptian character and custom. The Egyptians are forbidden by their religion even to kill animals for sacrifice, except sheep and such bulls and bull calves as have passed the test for cleanness, and geese. Is it likely, then, that they would sacrifice human beings? Besides, if Heracles was a mere man, as they say he was, and single-handed, how is it conceivable that he should have killed tens of thousands of people? And now I hope that both gods and heroes will forgive me for saying what I have said on these matters." So that's an amazing part. And I pulled that from a broader context. In this part, Herodotus knows that in the Egyptian pantheon of gods and the Greek pantheon, there are both characters named Heracles or Hercules. And he notices how Heracles plays different role in each pantheon. He's basically doing comparative mythology and finding inconsistencies. And once he goes through all of that, he says, "And now I hope that both gods and heroes will forgive me for saying what I have on these matters." That's amazing, because you got to remember that Herodotus, though he has points where he's maybe in disbelief, he does believe in the Greek pantheon. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades. This is real. This is real to the Greeks at the time. The gods are real, heroes are real, and the fact that he's sort of questioning their authority, he's basically saying, all right, well, I'm just asking questions. Please don't hurt me, Please, I ask for your forgiveness. So it's really interesting. So again, still in book 2, Egypt. It's such a great part of the book. I'm pulling this from a broader context, but I'm going to read it to you just so you get an idea of Herodotus talking about the Egyptian pantheon in relation to the Greeks. So Herodotus says, "Nevertheless, before their time, Egypt was, indeed, ruled by gods, who lived on earth amongst men, sometimes one of them, sometimes another being supreme above the rest. The last of them was Horus, the son of Osiris. Horus is the Apollo, Osiris the Dionysus of the Greeks. It was Horus who vanquished Typhon and was the last god to sit upon the throne of Egypt." So great mythological part. He's, talking about a time when Egypt was ruled by gods. And it's an important thing to remember. He says, Horus is the Apollo, Osiris the Dionysus of the Greeks. Parts like that, you got to remember, like, he is speaking to an Athenian audience. He has to make these gods, bring it into the terms that the Greeks would understand. So he's saying their God is like our God here, and this other God's like our God here, So it's important to remember, like, you're listening to Herodotus say this. He's telling you this stuff and making sense to you as a member of an Athenian audience. So, yeah, that's one thing. And then here's a part that I just absolutely loved. I circled the whole thing when I read it the first time, and I was just like, oh, wow. And this is a good example. This is mythology, but it's also a good example of Herodotus' digressions. He'll go, well, this happened here. Oh, and also this thing. And oh, yeah, this thing too. So he's just sort of digressing here a little bit. But he says in Book 4, there is, however, one other interesting thing besides the rivers and the vast extent of the plains, a footprint left by Hercules. The natives show this to visitors on a rock by the river Tirus. It is like a man's footprint, but is 3 feet long. I must now leave this subject and get back to the story which I set out to tell. So, yeah, not much more to be said about that, but it's just like, to them it was real. There's a footprint from Hercules. Pretty cool. And it's also like kind of like touristy, They bring the visitors there to show them. So this next reading I'm going to give, it sort of highlights the Greek belief systems at the time. And how mythology to us, but their religion to theirs, how that played a role in their life, how they, if something good happened that was fortunate for them, how they reacted. So in this context, the Greeks hear that a part of the Persian fleet has been destroyed in a storm. And so Herodotus says, on the second day of the storm, the lookout men on the Euboean hills came hurrying to the Greeks and described in detail the destruction of the Persian ships. On hearing the news, they offered prayers of thanksgiving and libations of wine to Poseidon the Savior, and made all speed to return to their station at Artemisium, in the expectation that only a few ships would be left to oppose them. For the second time, therefore, they lay off Artemisium. From that day to this, they have always addressed Poseidon by the title of Savior. That's a very interesting section. And for those unfamiliar with the Greek pantheon, Poseidon is the god of earthquakes, the god of land, god of the ocean. And so when they see the Persian ships destroyed by a storm, they basically say, okay, Poseidon, the god of the sea, did this for us. He has us in his favor. And so from that point on, they call him Poseidon the Savior. That's fascinating, that anthropological look at how that title developed. So that's just thrilling to read about. So the next section I want to highlight about Herodotus is I can only call these things Herodotian statements, or just Herodotus being himself. He gives these statements throughout the book where he's just like, this is what I heard. It's interesting, and I'm not going to pass judgment. But in him just adding whatever he thinks is interesting. And this is also highlights why Herodotus is just such a joy to read, because it's in these statements I'm about to read where you can definitely tell that this book was written to be heard. You feel like you're in the presence of Herodotus when he makes these statements. And so the first one I'll read is from Book 2, the Egyptian book. And he says, well, these things have been as they are since the beginning of time, and there is no changing them. So I will pass to another subject. Just those statements are awesome. I love that. And so now moving on later into the book, there is a part, I just love this part because it just caught me off guard. Okay, ready for this? Get ready to take notes. He says, of the numerous different ways of catching crocodiles, I will describe the one which seems to me the most worthy to report. This is a book about the Greco-Persian Wars, and he's telling us how to catch a crocodile. That's amazing. That is truly amazing. I think this perfectly highlights how unpredictable he is, because he'll tell you whatever he thinks is interesting. What is the best way of catching a crocodile? Oh, Herodotus, I would love to know. I would just love that, man. Tell me. So another section that I want to talk about is these sort of tall tales that Herodotus gives. Earlier in the video, we heard that statement of him just saying, I only know things from eyewitness up until this point, but from beyond that, it's all hearsay. So it's in the hearsay that we get a lot of these strange tales about things in far-off regions. And so I want to read a few examples of that. So in this section of Herodotus, this is a very famous section. the famous gold-digging ants. And so Herodotus says, there is found in this desert a kind of ant of great size, bigger than a fox, though not so big as a dog. Some specimens which were caught there are kept at the palace of the Persian king. These creatures, as they burrow underground, throw up the sand in heaps, just as ants in Greece throw up the earth, and they are very similar in shape. The sand has a rich content of gold, and this is that the Indians are after when they make their expeditions into the desert. And then he goes on describing the ants, how the ants chase after the men when they get the gold, and it's just thrilling to read about. But he's talking about gigantic ants that dig for gold. Okay. I just imagine being a member of the Athenian audience hearing this. You're like, there are gold digging ants the size of foxes out there? Holy crap, So that's thrilling to read about. So the next one, so this comes from book 4, and Herodotus writes, the country around here and the rest of Libya to the westward has more forests and a greater number of wild animals than the region which the nomads occupy. The latter, that is, eastern Libya, is low-lying and sandy as far as the river Triton, whereas the agricultural region to the west is very hilly and abounds with forests and animal life. It is here that the huge snakes are found, and lions, elephants, bears, asps, and horned asses, not to mention dog-headed men, headless men with eyes in their breasts. And then he says in quotations, I merely repeat what the Libyans say, wild men and wild women, and a great many other creatures by no means of a fabulous kind. Okay, dog-headed men, men with eyes in their breasts. I cannot imagine being an Athenian hearing this going, oh my God, just thinking about it. But like these tall tales, they're so interesting because this is what people thought and believed at the time. And Herodotus does not discriminate in telling these things. Because he says, I only repeat what the Libyans say, which leads us to believe, well, Herodotus didn't exactly believe this, but he's still telling you because it's interesting. So, and then for the next tall tale, I'll move on to that. And this part's interesting. This comes from book 4. He says, the bald men themselves tell the tale, and he says in parentheses, which I do not believe, that the mountains are inhabited by a goat-footed race, beyond which, still further north, are men who sleep for 6 months in the year, which to my mind is utterly incredible. And I agree. That is utterly incredible. I wonder if that's true. But yeah. And again, you get that Herodotian statement where he's like, I don't believe this, but also this is kind of incredible. Just it just makes me laugh every time he does this. And if he feels like he's in the room, it's just like he's talking to you. It's just amazing. And then in book 6, he writes, the sea in the neighborhood of Athos is full of monsters, so that those of the ships' companies who were not dashed to pieces on the rocks were seized and devoured. Okay, interesting. Sea monsters. And then this one to me is one of the strangest ones. This comes from book 8. This is in the book parts of the narrative where he's talking about the war. Specifically when Xerxes is invading Athens. And Herodotus says, almost out of nowhere, the Athenians say that the Acropolis is guarded by a great snake, which lives in the temple. Indeed, they believe so literally in its existence that they put out monthly offerings for it to eat in the form of a honey cake. Now that's just fascinating. Not only is it weird, a gigantic snake that eats honey cake, but it's through like this that we call him the father of history, because it makes history go from like black and white photographs, static photographs, to painting this picture that's vibrant and full of life and moving. It's a moving image. And so, yeah, you can go and look at the Acropolis and think, wow, what an incredible building and site this is. This is amazing. But when you read Herodotus, you find out, well, they believe there was a gigantic snake in there and they gave it honey cakes. So it really just enriches everything. This is why Herodotus is just brilliant. He doesn't hold anything back. He just tells it all. And I think that's just so fascinating. So to recap these tall tales, we've discussed goat-footed men, dog-headed men, gold-digging snakes, gold-digging ants the size of, foxes, gigantic snakes, sea monsters. This is a book about the Greco-Persian Wars. Again, I remind you, we're all over the place here. And it's amazing. It's amazing that there are so many more examples of this throughout the book. So that was the other section I wanted to highlight on. But now we can get into the main driving narrative, the war. The war. And also, I also want to mention one thing because I realized I forgot to mention this earlier. But there's an important thing that I need to highlight about ancient history in the event that you haven't read ancient history. And it's a very contentious topic. It has been for about 2,000 years now. And it's the speeches, the quote unquote speeches. So I'm going to talk about that briefly. So this tradition, the speeches, starts with Herodotus. And the speeches mean that in order for Herodotus to tell an engaging story and to liven things up, he will put dialogue in the mouths of historical characters. Dialogue that odds are he had no evidence for. He basically, using his imagination, tried to think what these historical figures were saying throughout his narrative. So an example I can give is in Book 1, which details the rise and fall of Cyrus the Great. He puts dialogue in the mouth of Cyrus. He gives Cyrus speeches to say. And so it's important to remember, Cyrus the Great is born around 600 BC. And I think dies around 540, 530 BC. And mind you, Herodotus is writing 100 years after this time period. But nonetheless, in his book where he talks about Cyrus the Great, he is going to put a speech in the mouth of Cyrus, which he probably had no evidence for. But again, he's telling a story to his Athenian audience, livening it up. And so I'm going to read to you the first Cyrus speech. So Herodotus says, "This was the answer which Cyrus wanted. He seized upon it at once and proceeded to lay bare what he had in mind. 'Men of Persia,' he said, 'listen to me. Obey my orders, and you will be able to enjoy 1,000 pleasures as good as this without ever turning your hands to servile labor. But if you disobey, yesterday's task will be the pattern of innumerable others you will be forced to perform. Take my advice and win your freedom. I am the man destined to undertake your liberation, and it is my belief that you are a match for the Medes in war as in everything else. It is the truth I tell you. Do not delay, but fling off the yoke of Astyages at once.'" So that's a speech right there that Cyrus almost definitely didn't say exactly. Maybe he said something like it, but Herodotus is going to he's going to use his imagination to tell you anyway. He's going to liven things up. And so he does that throughout the whole book. He gives Darius a speech, Xerxes a speech, and Miltiades and Themistocles, all these figures in the war he gives speeches to. And it's just to tell the story. And so later historians take up this tradition. Thucydides does, and Xenophon, and Livy, Tacitus. But later on, as you get through antiquity, there starts to be contention towards this idea of giving speeches because, the audience, though the audience knows that they're fake, it's later writers of antiquity are more concerned with the actual truth. So, and we don't do this today. Historians today don't make up dialogue. So this is a very ancient tradition that's now very much out of favor, and for good reason, because it's made up. But I wanted to highlight that in the event that you're interested in Herodotus. You're going to encounter speeches in the book, as well as other ancient historians. And it may seem strange at first, but it's just the author trying to liven things up and make it interesting. So I wanted to point that out. So I'm not going to go super in detail about the war because I think a lot of you know already the events. And but there's a few more famous sections that I want to read that are kind of ingrained in popular culture. And so in Book 7, there's an event that Herodotus tells that I think many of you will know. Even if you don't know anything about Herodotus or the Greco-Persian Wars, odds are you'll probably know about this specific event. And I'm going to read it, and then by the time I finish reading, you'll probably figure it out. So in Book 7, Herodotus writes, "To Athens and Sparta, Xerxes sent no demand for submission because of what happened to the messengers whom Darius had sent on a previous occasion. At Athens, they were thrown into the pit like criminals. At Sparta, they were pushed into a well and told that if they wanted earth and water for the king, to get them from there." So in the movie 300, that scene, this is Sparta, where they kick the messengers into the well. That's where that comes from Herodotus. So that whole scene comes from this one paragraph. Because I just thought that was interesting and worthy mentioning. Herodotus doesn't say Leonidas says this is Sparta. That does not happen. But anyway, so this is a longer section I'm going to read from, and in this part of the narrative, it's when Xerxes' forces are approaching the Hot Gates, where the Battle of Thermopylae happens, where the 300 are fighting under King Leonidas, or if we're to use the right pronunciation, Leonidas. That's the right way of pronouncing it, but I'll use Leonidas because it's more familiar. And so Xerxes sends a messenger or a spy to the pass where the Spartans and the other Greeks are waiting for Xerxes. They're there to fight. And geographically, it's like a mountainside and then a flat plain and then the sea. And so the Greeks, with the 300 in front, are barring the way from Xerxes' entire army invading Greece. And so the messenger is sent and sees the Spartans there, and they are combing their hair, and the messenger is confused. They're like, why are these Spartans there, and why are they combing their hair? Why are these people resisting us? And so Herodotus writes, back in his own camp, he told Xerxes what he had seen. Xerxes was bewildered. The truth, namely that the Spartans were preparing themselves to die and deal death with all their strength, was beyond his comprehension, and what they were doing seemed to him merely absurd. Accordingly, he sent for Demoritus, the son of Ariston, who had come with the army, and questioned him about the spy's report, in the hope of finding out what the behavior of the Spartans might mean. Once before, Demoritus said, when we began our march against Greece, you heard me speak of these men. I told you then how I saw this enterprise would turn out, and you laughed at me. I strive for nothing, my lord, more earnestly than to observe the truth in your presence. So hear me once more. These men have come to fight us for possession of the pass, and for that struggle they are preparing. It is the custom of the Spartans to pay careful attention to their hair when they are about to risk their lives. But I assure you that if you can defeat these men and the rest of the Spartans who are still at home, there is no other people in the world who will dare to stand firm or lift a hand against you. You have now to deal with the finest kingdom in Greece and with the bravest men. So that's a very interesting paragraph. And mind you, Demoritus, the person speaking, the dialogue that Herodotus makes up, he is an exiled king of Sparta, a former king of Sparta. And he is in council with the king of Persia, telling him what the Spartans are doing, because he used to be their king. So how about that for interesting? And so yes, this is Herodotus building up to the Battle of Thermopylae, and I won't read any more sections from that because I think it's thrilling reading and it's worthy of reading on your own. But in this book you get the Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Thermopylae, the naval battle of Salamis, and then decisive victory with the Battle of Plataea. And so, without getting too deep into the war, the rest of the book deals with all those events following the victory of the Greeks at Plataea. So now what I want to do is I want to talk about the criticism that Herodotus faced in antiquity. How did he come to develop the father of lies? How did he get that title? And so famously, Herodotus' biggest critic was a man named Plutarch. And I'm going to grab Plutarch's book real quick. So Plutarch wrote this book. It's a big book. He wrote even more than this. He wrote a series of essays, a series of moral essays. But this book here it's Plutarch's Lives, but it's also called The Parallel Lives. And also what I'm trying to say here is I'm trying to establish Plutarch's credibility as a critic of Herodotus. And Plutarch, before I talk about this, I should mention, Plutarch wrote an essay called On the Malice of Herodotus, which I'll get to in a second. But I want to talk about Plutarch as a source. So Plutarch lived around 500 years after Herodotus. He was born in the 1st century AD. And So he wrote this big book, The Lives. The word lives in this title is in reference to the fact that this is a big book of biographies, lives of historical figures. And it's not on this title, but it's also, since this book's also called The Parallel Lives, the word parallel comes from the fact that Plutarch will take one life, one biography, and then another biography, and if he finds similarities between the two lives, he will do an essay comparing the two. And the way he structures that is he'll take a Greek historical figure, and then he'll take a Roman historical figure, and if they shared similar lives, he will compare the two. So I can give two examples. The first two biographies he does in the book is a life of Theseus, who is the founder of Athens, essentially, the first king of Athens. The second biography is a life of Romulus, the founder of Rome. So he does a life of Theseus, the Greek, life of Romulus, the Roman, and then, following those two biographies, he does an essay titled A Comparison Between Theseus and Romulus. So, and then to do more, an example that isn't rooted in mytho-history, he does a life of Demosthenes, the most famous Greek orator, and then he does a life of Cicero, the most famous Roman orator, statesman, consul, we mentioned earlier in the video. He does a life of those two, the most famous Greek orator and the most famous Roman orator, and then he does an essay comparing Demosthenes with Cicero. So Plutarch is very familiar with dealing with historical literature and making biographies out of what he can. And so in this book, Plutarch's Lives, the Parallel Lives, he has 3 lives of historical figures that took part in the Greco-Persian War. So those lives are Themistocles, who was given the title of the architect of Greek victory, a very, very, very important historical figure. He does the life of Cimon, who was the son of Miltiades, the general who won the victory, the Battle of Marathon. Cimon was also a general of Athens and helped to build the Athenian naval empire and fought at Salamis. And then the third life that Plutarch does is one of a character named Aristides, and who also played a role in the Greco-Persian Wars and was a very famous Athenian, was nicknamed the Just, Aristides the Just. And so anyways, Plutarch does, as concerns with his book, he's writing biographies and he wants to do lives of 3 characters that took place in the Greco-Persian Wars. So who's he going to consult to get his information to make that biography? He's going to consult Herodotus as well as later sources after Herodotus. And so to write those biographies, Plutarch needs Herodotus, and then he uses other sources like Diodorus of Sicily, who wrote a book about, let's see here, where is it? So here's a book from Diodorus of Sicily. Diodorus of Sicily wrote a book called The Library of History, and parts of his book deal with the Greco-Persian War. So he's drawing from that source. He's drawing from Herodotus, and he's drawing from sources, I think, named Ephorus and Justin. And so he's looking at Herodotus, and then looking at all these other sources, and then he's looking back at Herodotus and saying, okay, I'm seeing big inconsistencies here. And it looks like Herodotus is showing and exhibiting bias towards certain Greek cities or certain ways of life, or maybe he's being too pro-barbarian. Anyways, Plutarch has a bone to pick with Herodotus, a big bone to pick. And hopefully I explained that well. So anyway, what I want to talk about is from this book, this Penguin volume. It's called On Writing History from Herodotus to Herodian. And Penguin has put that essay in this book, the one titled On the Malice of Herodotus. Now in this book, it's about, the essay is about 26 pages, and Plutarch goes through the events of Herodotus and says, okay, Herodotus is lying here, he's obfuscating the facts here, he's clearly showing malice in this regard, and it's like a very passionate essay just going after Herodotus. And so what I want to do to talk about this essay and to talk about how Herodotus earned this repute of being called the father of lies, I'm going to take two sections from the histories of Herodotus, and then I'm going to look at the essay here and bounce those two parts of Herodotus off this essay where Plutarch rips those parts apart and starts criticizing Herodotus. I hope I explained that well, but we'll get into it. So let's go back to Herodotus. So the part I'm about to read from Herodotus is when the Athenians know that the Persians are coming. This is 490 BC, and they're going to land at Marathon. And Athens sends a runner to Sparta to ask the Spartans for help. And then stuff follows. And I'm going to read those sections, and then we'll talk about what Plutarch has to say about that. So I'll now read that part. This is in Book 6 of Herodotus. So Herodotus says, on the occasion of which I speak, when Pheidippides, that is, was sent on his mission by the Athenian commanders and said that he saw Pan, he reached Sparta the day after he left Athens and delivered his message to the Spartan government. Men of Sparta, the message ran, the Athenians ask you to help them, and not to stand by while the most ancient city of Greece is crushed and enslaved by a foreign invader. For even now Etruria has been enslaved, and Greece is the weaker by the loss of one fine city. The Spartans, though moved by the appeal and willing to send help to Athens, were unable to send it promptly because they did not wish to break their law. It was the 9th day of the month, and they said that they could not take the field until the moon was full. So they waited for the full moon, and meanwhile Hippias, the son of Pisistratus, guided the Persians to Marathon. And then after that, a few pages later, Herodotus details the Battle of Marathon and how the Athenians were victorious. And then Herodotus writes, after the full moon, 2,000 Spartans set off for Athens. They were so anxious not to be late that they were in Attica on the 3rd day after leaving Sparta. They had, of course, missed the battle, but such was their passion to see the Persians that they went to Marathon to have a look at the bodies. That done, they praised the Athenians on their good work and returned home. So, basically Herodotus says, because Athens was in trouble, they knew that the Persians were going to land and try to make way for the city. They sent a runner to Sparta. By the way, Sparta is 140 miles away from Athens. So, and Herodotus says that the runner got there the next day. So this runner was sent, this professional long-distance runner, ran 140 miles in basically a day, 2 days. So, and then the Spartans get to Greece from Sparta. 2,000 of them get to Athens in 3 days. 3 days, 140 miles, and you're wearing like armor. Incredible. But the Spartans weren't there because their law says they cannot take the field until the moon is full. And so they waited for the full moon, and then they went to Greece. So that's what Herodotus says. Now let's look at what Plutarch has to say about that event. So before I read this statement from Plutarch, I want to make one clarification. The Spartans they are also referred to as the Lacedaemonians. Herodotus does this in his narrative. They call them the Spartans. They call them the Lacedaemonians. It means the same thing. In this context, in the sections I just read from Herodotus, he calls the Spartans. Here, Plutarch calls the Spartans the Lacedaemonians. So just remember that. So Plutarch says, and further, he has already been clearly convicted of making false accusations against the Lacedaemonians in the matter of the full moon. He says that they were awaiting this, and that was why they did not bring help to the Athenians at Marathon. But not only have they made countless expeditions and battles when the moon was full, but even this battle, which occurred on 6 Bodromion, they only just missed, such that they in fact could see the corpses when they arrived at this place. So the next big thing, so Plutarch just said Herodotus is a liar. That's one example of Plutarch calling Herodotus a liar. The second thing that Plutarch says is Herodotus is so pro-Athenian that he slanders the other Greek city-states. So I'm going to read a statement from Herodotus, a section from Book 7 that can be seen as pro-Athenian, though it's a little bit hard to disagree with Herodotus' assessment. We'll read this, and then we'll read what Plutarch has to say regarding pro-Athenian bias. So Herodotus says, in view of this, therefore, one is surely right in saying that Greece was saved by the Athenians. It was the Athenians who held the balance. Whichever side they joined was sure to prevail. It was the Athenians, too, who, having chosen that Greece should live and preserve her freedom, roused to battle the other Greek city-states which had not yet submitted. It was the Athenians who, after the gods, drove back the Persian king. Not even the terrifying warnings of the oracle at Delphi could persuade them to abandon Greece. They stood firm and had the courage to meet the invader. So it's also important, again, to remember Herodotus was reciting for an Athenian audience. So, he's certainly not going to slander his patrons, but, he's definitely showing some sort of bias towards the Athenians. He's definitely pro-Athenian, but there's no denying that the Athenians played an absolutely crucial role in the Greco-Persian Wars. But now let's look at what Plutarch has to say. So here's a section of on the Malice of Herodotus that criticizes this pro-Athenian bias. So Plutarch says, well then, he has here portrayed the Athenians at least as great and called them saviors of Greece, which was proper and just, indeed, except for the many slanderous remarks to be found amongst the praises. He says that the Lacedaemonians, when portrayed by the rest of the Greeks and isolated, would have performed great deeds and died nobly. Or, before this happened, they would have come to an agreement with Xerxes when they saw the rest of the Greeks taking the Persian side. It is clear he says this not to praise the Athenians, but instead praises the Athenians in order to speak badly of all the others. So, very interesting take from Plutarch. And then later on, from page 319 of this book, Plutarch says, he does not know how to praise without blaming. To praise one man, he has to ruin the reputation of an entire city and people. Of earlier writers, Hellenicus, and of later writers, Ephorus, both bear witness against Herodotus. And then he gives further examples of that. But this goes to show you, the language of Plutarch. There are other parts of this where he's just, the pen is hot, he's really, at several points, he's addressing Herodotus directly in his essay, even though Plutarch lives 500 years after Herodotus. He's saying, you're lying, you did this, you did that, you're awful, So he's using the word you, as if he's talking to Herodotus. So, to conclude this section talking about criticism that Herodotus faced, Plutarch has a nice anecdote at the end. This is in the final paragraph. He says, what can we say then? The man knows how to write. His account is pleasurable, and there is charm, force, and grace in his narrative. And he has recounted his tale like a poet, not knowledgeably, but instead sweetly and with polish. It is no doubt these aspects that beguile and win over everyone. But just as one must watch out for the rose beetle among the roses, so one must be on one's guard against Herodotus' defamation and abuse, which lie beneath a smooth and soft appearance, lest we unwittingly accept absurd and false notions about the best and greatest cities and men of Greece. So it's a nice change of turn after a viper attack in the previous parts of the essay. But here's the fortunate thing for us in the modern day. Scholars, to the extent that they can, have distinguished the fact and fiction in Herodotus. So we don't have to worry about the rose beetle. Yeah, he says the rose beetle. We don't have to worry about that. We can just enjoy Herodotus, because even if he's telling fiction, or maybe he's lying or being pro-Athenian, we have scholars to distinguish that, and so it's not our concern. And all we can do is just enjoy Herodotus for what he has to say, because he reveals so much about the world during the 5th century, and it's amazing. So now I want to quickly talk about some more modern... Oh, wait, actually, there's one thing I forgot to mention. I showed at the beginning of the video. So there is actually another writer from antiquity who kind of also writes about the Persian War, the Greco-Persian War. And many of you probably know him. It's Aeschylus, and Aeschylus wrote the Oresteia trilogy. But he also wrote a play called The Persians, which It's a play about Xerxes, and there's the ghost of Darius and Xerxes' mother Atossa, and it's regarding a battle during the Greco-Persian Wars, the Battle of Salamis. Um, but Aeschylus fought at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, and he also was at the Battle of Salamis. So this play was about King Xerxes, and the ghost of Darius was written by a man who fought in of some of the most important battles in the war. So that's interesting. So just it's worthy mentioning, I guess, that Aeschylus is also a fighter during the Greco-Persian Wars. And so now we can get to the more modern day sources. So there's this book, The Greco-Persian Wars by Peter Green. I read this book and to help me distinguish, to look at the war from a military perspective, a military history of the Greco-Persian Wars. And it's a good book, thoroughly researched. Peter Green is a very well-respected scholar and is very steeped in the field. And so this is a really good book to really dig into the Greco-Persian Wars. It's at times I found it laborious, and at times Peter Green definitely comes off as a little bit full of himself, I want to say. But it's a very good book for finding out what actually happened in the war and distinguishing the fact and fiction from Herodotus. Okay, so the last nonfiction book I want to mention is this book here. It's The World of Herodotus by Aubrey de Sélincourt. So Aubrey de Sélincourt was the one who translated my copy of Herodotus. So after spending months reading this book, I started this book in June. I finished in October. I am a slow reader. And I took my time with this book, and I wrote in it. I took it everywhere. I lived in it, and it was my companion. I took some breaks from it, but I came back. And so I spent such a great deal of time with his translation. And then following me finishing the Histories, his translation, I read this book, which is just him providing context for Herodotus, going through the events described in Herodotus, and talking about the various literary forms in Greece at the, leading up to Herodotus and afterwards. And it's just this very passionate book about Greece and the Greece of Herodotus, and just what's so wonderful about Greece and Herodotus himself. It's a thrill to read, and it is written beautifully. This is some of the best nonfiction prose I've ever seen, and it's one of those books, at least for me, where I had a great deal of difficulty putting it down. It's no longer out of print, but you can find it, I believe, fairly cheap from used booksellers. So if this does interest you, I highly recommend it. And so to close out here, I want to read a section of this book, a small paragraph that beautifully articulates just some of the most amazing aspects of Herodotus. I'm going to read that for you real quick. So this comes from a chapter called The Question of Bias, in which the author, de Sélincourt, is writing about to what extent Herodotus is biased. But in this chapter, he writes, Herodotus' approach is different. He had, to be sure, much to say about the odd practices of foreigners, not excluding the lunatic excesses of Cambyses in Egypt. But his tone is never the tone of indignation, but rather that of the curious and interested observer. Now isn't that odd, he seems to say. Would you have ever thought that people could behave like that? But they do, And as he says it, the darkness which surrounded the floodlit stage thins away, and the reader is aware that the barbarians, for all their unintelligible twittering, are men and women, subject to the same passions and the same chances as himself. It is a wonderful widening of horizons. So that is the video. I hope you enjoyed, and I thank you if you made it this far, because this is probably a very long video. And so yeah, the point I want to make is, if you haven't read Herodotus, I cannot recommend him enough. If you read him, he will start to feel like a friend. If you read his book, it's strange. It feels like he's right there next to you, talking to you. We talked about how he wrote it so that it could be spoken. It feels like he's speaking to you. After 2,500 years, it still feels like he's talking. So I cannot recommend him enough. What an incredible reading experience. And I hope I made a strong case. And so go seek out Herodotus, make his acquaintance, and find out what happened when King Xerxes invaded Greece.